This PowerPoint is going to introduce you to overheads and absorption costing and will tie in with Chapter 4 of your workbook. So, just a reminder of overheads. They are running costs incurred by a business. They are also indirect costs. We can classify overheads according to function. So they can be production overheads, which would be things like supervisor salary in the factory, depreciation of factory machinery, heat and light of the factory. Could be selling and distribution overheads, which could be sales staff salaries, delivery driver salaries, costs of delivery. Administration overheads, which could be admin staff salaries, and finally finance overheads, which are overheads in relation to the finance of the business, such as interest on loans. Now, overheads have to be included in the total cost of a product, and again, you should remember this from Chapter 1. So when we're looking at total cost, we have direct material plus the direct labour plus the direct expenses gives us the prime cost. We then add production overheads to give us the production cost, and finally the non-production overheads being the selling and distribution, the admin and the finance, and that gives us our total cost. Now, it's fairly easy to produce one of these summaries for a period of time, for example a quarter or for the year. But what about if we want to produce it for just one specific product? Same layout, as you can see. We start off with our direct costs, the direct material, the direct labour, the direct expenses, and that gives us the prime cost. But generally, if we're working out the cost of one specific product, we add all the overheads together, so production and non-production overheads, and just add it as one figure. Now, the problem we have is that our overheads tend to be for a period of time. So, for example, we could have rent for the quarter of £10,000. How do we split that down to work out how much of it we should add to the prime cost of just one product? Because that is for a quarter. And that's what we're going to be looking at. What we're going to be doing is something called absorption costing. Absorption costing uses overhead absorption rates, which you'll see abbreviated to OARs. And those are used to absorb the cost of the overhead into the prime cost. In other words, we use an OAR to add an amount of overhead to the prime cost to get the total cost of the product. To work out our OAR, we use a formula which is our budgeted overhead divided by our budgeted activity level. And I'll come back to that shortly. Now, if an organisation produces several products in different departments, then what we do have to do is, before we calculate our overhead absorption rates, we have to work out how much of the overhead relates to each of the departments. As some of those overheads might be specific to a department, some of the overheads can relate to all the departments and so have to be apportioned across all departments. That's something that we're going to be looking at next week. Okay, so you just need to be aware of that. But for the moment, we're just going to look at our overhead absorption rate. Now, we know then that we need to have an overhead absorption rate so that we can add an amount of overhead to our prime cost to give us the total cost of the product. However, because overheads very often are invoiced on maybe a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, we may not know what our overhead cost is until after we've produced the product. Similarly, things like the hours that it takes to produce the product, we don't know that until after the product's been produced. So therefore, to calculate an overhead absorption rate using our actual figures, we would have to wait until we'd produced the product. But that is not what we want. If we need to quote for a job, we need to know what it's going to cost before we produce our product to know whether it's actually viable to go ahead or not. So because of that, what we do is calculate what are referred to as predetermined overhead absorption rates. And what we do is use budgeted figures. So going back to our formula again, our overhead absorption rate is our budgeted overhead divided by a budgeted activity level. What we mean by activity level is usually labour hours. So how many labour hours were worked in that period of time, or were expected to be worked if we're using budgeted figures. If it is very machine intensive industry, then the budgeted activity level can be machine hours. So it would be our budgeted overhead divided by budgeted machine hours. You will sometimes see units used as activity level, so the number of units produced, and there are other activity levels that can be used that you may come across in different questions. What you need to ensure that you do is make sure that the figures relate to the same time period. And what I mean by that is that if your budgeted overhead figure is for the quarter, then you need to make sure that the activity level, whether it's labour hours or machine hours, is also for the quarter. So for example, if our budgeted overhead for January to March is expected to be £10,000, we need to know that the labour hours expected to work for the same time period, January to March, let's say they're 5,000. So therefore our OAR, budgeted overhead, 10,000, budgeted activity level, which is labour hours, 5,000, gives us £2 per labour hour. So we see that the budgeted overhead figure relates to January to March. The budgeted labour hours relate January to March. That's really important. For some questions you won't be given that information, but you can work it out. So remember, time periods must be the same. So that's how you work out a predetermined overhead absorption rate. What you will find, which is something that we will look at in a couple of weeks, is that because we're using a predetermined rate, the overheads that we've absorbed or added into the cost of our product will differ to the actual overheads incurred. And what we have is something called an under or over absorption of overheads. But again, that's something we look at in a couple of weeks' time. So let's look at an example. So this example is also in your workbook. So we've got a new car service business. It's been opened by Adam and Bernard. So they want to work out what they're going to charge in order to make sure that they make a profit. They've got details of the costs of the materials they use, and they've also decided what rate to charge for their own time. And they're not intending on employing anyone else. But they need to think about their overheads. How are they going to add to the material and labour cost an amount to cover their overheads? Things like the rent of the garage, the heat and light, the insurance. What they've done is estimated, so there we have a budgeted figure, that their overheads will be £40,000 per annum. They've also worked out that they expect, so again, it's a budgeted figure, an estimation, to work 5,000 hours during the year. So we can work out an overhead absorption rate. We're looking for our budgeted overhead, which is £40,000, and we're looking for our budgeted activity level. So that's, as I said, usually labour hours or machine hours. We've been given a figure for labour hours, so we just need to make sure that they're the same time period. So the overheads is for the year, the 5,000 labour hours are also for the year. So 40,000 divided by 5,000 gives us an overhead absorption rate of £8. Now you must remember to write after it per labour hour. If we divided by machine hours, then it would be per machine hour. £8 on its own is not the overhead absorption rate. You must remember to state afterwards what it is. So is it per labour hour? Is it per machine hour? Is it per unit? So what this is telling us is that in order to add to our prime cost an amount to cover our overheads, we need to add £8 for every labour hour that's worked. So that's our overhead absorption rate. Now, if we know that the service takes 3 hours, then the overheads that we would need to absorb, remember absorb means add, it's £8. We've worked that out, and we know that is £8 per labour hour. This particular job is going to take 3 hours, so £8 per hour times 3 hours means that we need to add £24 to cover the overheads. So let's look at how we can use that to arrive at a cost for a job. So we're given the material cost, so direct material is £30. Direct labour, it took 3 hours and the labour is £12 an hour, so that's £36. 3 hours times £12. There are no direct expenses, so if we add these two together, we have the prime cost. £66. Now we need to add the overheads. We've worked those out, £8 an hour, and this job takes 3 hours. So our overheads £24 means that the cost of a service is £90. So that's how much it's going to cost them to provide the service on a car. That's not what they're going to charge the customer, because that is what it's costing them. They hope to see a 50% markup. So that's their profit. Their profit should be 50% of their cost. So if we now add the profit, £90, 50% of that, okay, because £90 is how much it's costing. We want to have a 50% profit. So we want to make a profit of £45. So therefore, the charge to the customer has to be £135. So that's the selling price. So provided their calculations are correct, if they charge £135 for a service, they will make £45 profit, and the cost in terms of material, labour and overheads of providing that service is £90. So we've used our overhead absorption rate to work out how to absorb or add the overheads to the prime cost. Okay, so now we're going to think about what's known as a blanket rate, and that's basically what we have used in the previous example. It's nothing different to calculate. What we're saying is that if a business uses a blanket rate, it will work out one overhead absorption rate, and that overhead absorption rate will be used to add the overheads to the prime cost for every one of the products they produce. So they'll be using just one rate for the whole organisation. Now this is quick and easy to calculate and understand, but in reality it's not particularly accurate, because most businesses produce more than one product, and the products might be produced in different ways. Some of them could be produced by hand using a lot of labour hours. Some of them could be produced by machine using a lot of machine hours. So those products that are produced by machine, an overhead absorption rate of machine hours would be suitable. But if a product is produced by hand, then an overhead absorption rate of labour hours is more suitable. If we only have one rate, which one do we use, a labour hour rate or a machine hour rate? That's why it's not ideal, because of the fact it's assuming that all overheads will be absorbed on the same basis. But we'll start by having a look at an example. So here is example 4.1. Again, you will find this in your workbook. So a business produces 2 products, including the XR12, and it's expected to incur the following overhead costs in the next accounting period. So that tells us that these are budgeted figures. It's what we're expecting to incur. So it's a budget. Oh, sorry, just jump back. Right, so we have all these overheads. They have been totaled up. If you have a list of overheads and they haven't been totaled up, then you just total them up. So our overheads budgeted figure is £43,000. That's for the next accounting period. The business uses a labour hour blanket rate. So if we think about that, what that means, they're using one overhead absorption rate for the whole business, and the fact that it's a labour hour rate tells us that we need to divide our overhead by the labour hours. So if we carry on reading through, they expect to produce 2,000 XR12s in the next period. Each XR12 is expected to take 5 hours to produce. In total, the business expects to work 20,000 labour hours in the next period. And you're required to calculate the overhead to be absorbed by each unit of XR12. So the first thing we need is an overhead absorption rate. You can't work out the overheads absorbed unless you have an overhead absorption rate. So if you think back to your formulae, to calculate your overhead absorption rate, it's your budgeted overheads divided by your budgeted activity level. So if we look at our overheads, because we're producing just one overhead absorption rate, we need the total budgeted overheads, which we know is £43,000. That's for the next accounting period. Divide that by the budgeted activity level, and we know that we need to use labour hours. So we're looking for the budgeted labour hours. Need to get the time periods the same. So we're looking for the budgeted labour hours in the next accounting period. And there we have it. 20,000 labour hours in the next accounting period. So we have two pieces of information that we need to calculate our overhead absorption rate. So our overhead absorption rate is equal to the budgeted overheads divided by budgeted activity, and our overheads were £43,000 and our budgeted activity for the same time period 20,000 hours. So that comes out to £2.15 per labour hour. So that is telling us that our overheads are £2.15 for every labour hour worked. Now if I just go back to the previous slide, we were asked to calculate the overhead to be absorbed by each unit of XR12. Remember, absorbed means to add. So what is the amount of overheads that we will add to the prime cost for each XR12? We've worked out an overhead absorption rate. It's £2.15 per labour hour. So for each XR12, what will our overheads be? We know it's £2.15 per labour hour. So what we now need is how many labour hours does an XR12 take? And that information is given. XR12 takes 5 hours. So the overhead to be absorbed by each XR12, so I'll go back to the next slide. One XR12 takes 5 hours. The overhead absorption rate is £2.15 per labour hour. So the overhead absorbed or added, £2.15 for every labour hour, and the XR12 takes 5 labour hours. So the total amount that we will add to cover overheads is £10.75. So the overhead absorbed £10.75. So what we're saying is that it's taking £10.75's worth of overheads to produce an XR12. So that's how we work out an overhead absorption rate, and how we then apply that overhead absorption rate to work out the amount of overheads absorbed. If you'd like to have a look in your workbook, there's question 4.1a. Just have a go at that one before we meet again, and then I can just check everybody's understanding and we can move on at that point to have a look at some of the other questions. So just 4.1a for the moment, and by all means go back through the PowerPoint, follow it through again and ensure that you've got a full understanding. As I said, it is also in the workbook, so you could, if you prefer, just read through the workbook now. And we'll meet soon to go through some more examples. Okay, thank you.